Hello and welcome to this No Cold War Britain webinar. My name is Fiona Edwards and I'm a member of the No Cold War Britain team, and I'll be co-chairing this evening's event alongside Suzie Gilbert. Today we are discussing an incredibly important subject, that is, opposing the new age of US militarism, Britain's junior role in new threats to world peace. We are joined today by a brilliant panel of speakers, including anti-war voices from Britain and internationally, including from the Global South, United States, Spain, and Canada. I'm delighted to announce that we'll also be treated to a live musical performance this evening, which I'll come on to very, very shortly. Firstly, just a few words on why we're organising today's event. We are living through perilous times. The United States administration is intent on escalating its aggressive foreign policy on two fronts simultaneously against both Russia and China. This US aggression is seriously destabilising the world and is posing a major threat to world peace. In waging this dangerous militarized offensive, the United States is attempting to draw in allies from the global north to play a belligerent role in supporting these US-led attacks. Britain is unfortunately playing a leading role in supporting the US as a junior partner, or poodle, as many commentators would suggest. In just a couple of weeks' time, the NATO Summit will be happening in Madrid at the end of June. This summit takes place as NATO, which is an expansionist military nuclear alliance, is escalating its aggressive activities. And this is principally the case in its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. NATO is seeking to prolong this conflict in Ukraine instead of seeking to bring an end to it through peace talks and a political solution. In fact, it was the US policy over decades to expand NATO into Eastern Europe and the threat to extend it into Ukraine that was a key factor in causing the current conflict. At the same time, under the leadership of the United States, NATO is also expanding its activities once again far outside its official area of interest, the North Atlantic, into Asia, and China is the key target. In fact, the US political establishment has identified China as its number one enemy. And in the words of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, stopping the rise of China is regarded as the US's greatest geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. And as the US's economic war on China fails, we are seeing Washington shifting its aggression more and more onto the military terrain, where the US has great power, including 800 foreign military bases, a huge nuclear arsenal, and by far the largest military budget in the entire world. And so we are seeing US militarization of the South China Sea and the Pacific is increasing, and this is all targeting against China. In particular, the US is stepping up its aggressive policies around Taiwan, attempting to undermine the One China policy, which has been the foundation of peaceful relations between China and the US for 50 years. And Britain is following as a junior partner in all of this, behind both NATO and the United States in these threatening developments. So opposing this increasing escalation, aggression, and militarism from the United States and Britain and their allies is a theme of today's webinar. Before we start with the speakers, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Callum Baird, who is going to perform live for us. Callum is a rising Scottish folk star and a supporter of the No Cold War movement. Over to you, Callum.
Hi, comrades. Thanks very much for having me here. Greetings from sunny Scotland. It's not often I get to say that, so I'm going to make the most of it while I can. Thank you very much for having me here. As I say, it's a pleasure to play here and support the event. And I'm going to play one of my own songs just now, which is called The Ever Willing Soldier. And it's based on a quote by Woody Guthrie, who said he'd like to see every soldier in the world sit down at the side of the road, put down their guns, talk about all the war and conflict they've been involved in, all the death and misery they've witnessed. And I wrote this song imagining what a conversation like that might sound like. So this is called The Ever Willing Soldier. I travel the world with my pack and my gun. I've taken in the rain and I've taken in the sun. I've seen deserts and sand dunes, rivers and trees. And I brought native towns down to their knees. And I do it for democracy, I do it for the oil. I do it for freedom and a share of the spoils. I do it for hope and I do it for free thoughts. I do it 'cause it's what the boardroom wants. I've helped empires rise and I toppled them too. And I shot men no different to me and to you. And I put an end to peace and I kick-started war. I've taken 1,000 daughters no matter what for. Oh, and I was there when the Tsar heard the curtain call, and I flew the plane over Syria as the bombs began to fall. But it was my blood spilled in the fields. When the battle cries, humanity yields. Like every toy, I'm tied to the game. The war is my ball and the market is my chain. I'm an ever-willing soldier, no longer young and getting older. One of these days I'll be in a row of graves. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers. Thank you. Thanks again for having me, and I hope you enjoy the meeting. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Callum. What a fantastic way to start the evening. Please do check out Callum's work. He's got a website where you can, and a Spotify, so do check him out. Our first speaker tonight, it's a great privilege to have Kate Hudson join us, who is the General Secretary of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and a leading voice in Britain and internationally for peace. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thanks to the organisers for putting this very important meeting together. So much as our Prime Minister likes to give the impression that Britain is a big global player, the fact is that Britain has been in decline since the end of the 19th century. And of course, it was finally superseded by the United States in the 1950s at the time of the Suez Crisis. So since then, Britain has played second fiddle to the United States, being its most loyal ally, making much of the so-called special relationship between the two countries. The idea, of course, is that Britain will be in on the winning side, that it will take spoils of war, and we've seen how it profits in terms of the arms trade, contracts for rebuilding after wartime destruction that it has caused, and so on. And it also works to support the US and back its interests. In the old days, when Britain was in the European Union, people used to describe Britain as America's Trojan horse in Europe. Whether the US views the relationship as particularly special is another question altogether, of course. All the fantastic economic deals with the US that were supposed to be happening after Brexit have been a long time coming. But the fact that Britain is very much a secondary player to the US does not mean that it is not still a wealthy country with a significant military. It is also very dangerous in its own right, playing an extremely negative and brutal role in global politics. We've seen this either directly or indirectly with regard to the Iraq War, to Palestine, to Yemen, to countless other conflicts, not to mention economic exploitation, mistreatment of migrants and refugees, and other crimes. We are also now seeing Britain playing an active role in supporting the US in its recent ideological and military initiatives. Britain was pretty much the first state to fully embrace the US's new authoritarianism versus the great democracies defending liberty narrative. We saw this very clearly at the beginning of last year when the British government published its so-called Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy. The review projects and promotes a post-Brexit global Britain that is on the offensive, projecting force globally. Indeed, it has been summarised as an attack document. It makes much of Britain being Western Europe's most heavily armed nation, of its leadership role in NATO, and its deploying of forces worldwide. Britain is ready to deter and defeat if necessary. Its stated determination to defend democracy against systemic competition, shaping a new open international order, is straight out of the US book. And there is much that is reminiscent of the strategies and postures of the Trump administration. And we've seen a lot of continuity with that under Biden. So there is a lot about how great Britain is, but Britain is also situated firmly as the US's junior partner. That's the clear message throughout, that global Britain really means Britain doing the US's bidding across the globe. I'd just like to touch on a couple of specific examples of where this is particularly dangerous, as it can lead to increased nuclear tension, adding to the nuclear dangers we're currently facing as a result of the war in Ukraine. Firstly, Britain's role in the so-called AUKUS agreement signed last autumn. This means that the US and UK are going to collaborate with Australia to help provide them with nuclear-powered submarines. Bizarrely, the joint government statement at the time suggested that this would promote stability in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, it is designed to fully pull Australia into the US orbit, where previously it had good relations with China, and it is already ramping up tension in the region. This risks nuclear proliferation and will also give Australia greater military capacity in the region. Nuclear-powered submarines can go much further afield than the diesel subs that they used to have, because nuclear-powered subs, do not have to be refueled. Talk of British use of Australian military facilities is also under discussion. My second example really shows so clearly the dual function of Britain as both a cat's paw of the US and a menace in its own right. This is the recent news that US nuclear weapons are coming back to Britain. We got rid of them through vigorous protesting in 2008. Now the US plans to bring them back as part of strengthening NATO's nuclear capacity in Europe. In itself, this adds up to provocation in the context of the Ukraine war. The British government is accepting this, even though it puts us even more on the front line in further US wars. But equally, Britain continues to have its own nuclear weapons. And in fact, last year, the government announced that it was increasing the UK nuclear arsenal by over 40%. So we're taking a double nuclear blow here, and internationally, of course, at the hands of both the US and UK governments. So all this and much more means that it is more important than ever to get active against war, against the arms trade, against nuclear weapons. If we want to have a future, now is the time to mobilise and fight for a different world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And one of the best ways, if not the best way you can contribute to the struggle against nuclear weapons is to join CND, which is amazing work in mobilising against this threat. And as Kate says, this is work's going to get more and more important because of Britain's increasingly menacing role in the world. Our next speaker is Ping Hua. She's an academic at the University of Southampton, a member of the No Cold War Britain organising team, and also an important voice and activist in the Chinese community in Britain. So I'd like to hand it over to you, Ping.
Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction. Welcome and thank you all for joining this important and timely online rally. And I'm honoured and very pleased to be speaking here along with such a great panel. On 26th of May, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered a speech as an evaluation summary of the Trump administration's Chinese policy. It is also a continuation of the Trump administration's tone towards China and US relations. The Biden administration's action towards China are hostile, and the Blinken speech is also full of smears and attacks on China, which expose the selfishness and the hypocrisy of the United States. Chinese Assistant Foreign Minister and the spokesperson Hua Chunying sent over 10 tweets in a row in the following day, giving a point-by-point response to the contents of the Blinken speech. Here are the key points that I would like to share with you. Blinken claims that the US is not looking for conflicts or a new Cold War, yet speech sounds more like a declaration of all-out strategy competition on war against China. Blinken also said the US would defend international law and maintain peace and security. Still, over 80% of the war after World War II were caused by US. Saying the US would protect the rights of individuals and the sovereignty of the nation is a joke. It invaded and managed the regime changes in over 20 countries in the last decades alone. Claim the US doesn't seek to block China from its role as a major power is a liar. If this is the case, why the US being strengthening the Five Eyes? Peddling, quote, put together AUKUS and enhance the bilateral military alliances in China's neighborhood. So ascertaining the US doesn't seek to block China from growing its economy and advancing its interests of its people is another lie. If so, why does the US raise and maintain the high tariff? Why does it suppress Chinese high-tech firms? Advocating all countries will be free to chart the path without coercion is merely a blantancy. So what is the US doing towards the Latin American and the South Pacific island countries? Accusing China of costing American workers millions of jobs is groundless. They are scapegoating again. The truth is that tariff war imposed on China cost American companies $1.7 trillion US and 240,000 jobs in the US. Blaming China for the so-called human rights violation without a truth does not stop people from criticizing the US politicians' selfishness, indifference, arrogance, and inabilities. 21 people, including 19 lovely kids, fall victims to the cold-blooded killer in Rhodes Elementary School, which is a human rights issue that Blinken hates to mention. Arguing that US One China policy is different from the One China principle is incomprehensible. There's only one China globally, and Taiwan is part of China. The government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. Blinken doesn't like a Chinese government. He has been trying carefully to separate the CPC from the Chinese people. The truth is, Chinese government and the CPC enjoys 95% satisfaction and approval rate among 1.4 billion people. Harvard University Kennedy School has conducted polls in China for 10 consecutive years. The result shows that the Chinese people's satisfaction with the government has remained above 90%, far above Joe Biden's 36% approval rating. And according to the recent Gallup poll, 83% of the American are dissatisfied with the way things are going in the US at this time. The US itself is the biggest destroyer of the international order today. It has a historic place. Domestic law above the international law impose sanctions on other countries of every term, broken treaties and the withdrawing from international borders, interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and frequently wage wars. So in his speech, Blinken talks about how the United States will continue to engage in force all-around competition with China, completely excited the rhetoric of the Trump administration, and the strategically competition with China was entirely provoked unilaterally by the United States. In his speech, Blinken also repeatedly rhetoric that the US does not want to see a new Cold War between China and the US. It is not only hypocritical and also dangerous. The US government has deliberately launched a trade war against China and built a military alliance to contain China in the Asian Pacific region, the so-called Indo-Pacific, not even existing on any map. These so-called competitive tactics against China fully exposed the US Cold War mentality, harming Chinese interests and seriously damaging relations between the two nations. While the US provoked China fiercely and relentlessly, the US wanted China to cooperate, manage risk, and avoid conflict. Blinken reiterated that the US does not support Taiwan independence, but never stop making petty moves or even deliberately provocative attempts to deflate and hollow out of the One China principle. After state the One China principle in black and white, the US has taken it upon itself to enact the Taiwan Relation Act, putting its domestic law above the agreement between China and the US. Joe Biden has also arrogantly claimed at least 3 times that the US will intervene militarily in the Taiwan issue in an attempt to contain China with Taiwan. Such a provocation by the US side seriously threaten the peace and the stability of the Taiwan Strait. The smear campaign against China's political system and human rights is a constant tactic of the US government. The rigid, hegemonic thinking of the United States fundamentally does not allow China to rise. The rugged nature of the United States determines that its suppression, containment, differentiation, and encirclement and suppression of China has no bottom line. It will not accept that any other country on earth can compare with it, not just in terms of social system, ideology, culture, tradition, etc. The big brother of the United States has already eliminated 4 of the world's second largest player, Britain, Germany, Soviet Union, and Japan. This fact tells us that as long as China rises, the United States will do everything possible to suppress it, believing that China's development is the original sin. The British government closely followed the United States, centering the interest of Americans hegemonic rather than the well-being of its own people, even sacrificing the interests of its own people to win the favor of its master, such as recently increasing the military spending to aid the US proxy war against Russia, while its people are struggling in fighting with the unbearable inflation, more people are now relying on food bank. Be the vanguard on the road of anti-China and the containment of China, persecuting, smearing, and witch hunter dissidents. It has accommodated and supported Hong Kong independence activists and the goods of a democracy and the human right, and has become a hotbed for cultivating radicals. Finally, the world faces serious threats such as the COVID pandemic and the climate change, which require serious global cooperation to tackle. We demand our government to abandon the Cold War mentality and advocate win-win cooperations. Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ping. And I thought it was very important to expose the astounding hypocrisy of the United States and Britain, for that matter, when it comes to trying to lecture China on both human rights and democracy, which I thought you did fantastically. I mean, look at what Britain, how much democracy, freedom and human rights there were for Hong Kong during the 150 years of British colonial rule. So thank you very much for your contribution, Ping. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce, is Ajamu Baraka from the United States. He is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace and stood as the Green Party candidate for Vice President of the United States in 2016. Over to you, Ajamu.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this very important series of conversations at this very critical moment in history. It's interesting that we are having this conversation just a few days from an event that occurred in the US, the so-called Summit of the Americas, hosted by the United States of America, and theoretically a meeting that was supposed to attract and gain the participation of nations across our region. But of course, that didn't happen. And I start with this because this is related, I think, to our conversation today, because, you know, it's quite clear that the US, with its allies, and one of its main allies being Britain, they're not going to be persuaded to abandon their objective interests, to utilize other approaches to attempt to try to maintain US and European hegemony outside of the decision that they have made to use military force in order to maintain that hegemony. What is going to be required, my friends, is a more effective global political opposition. Now, that opposition is difficult to achieve, especially as we see how events have unfolded in Europe around the issue of Ukraine and the kind of solidarity that was generated among Europeans vis-a-vis Ukraine and actually the rest of the world, because we saw that there was a clear line of demarcation between the support for this unnecessary, this manufactured war in Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia, and the rest of the world, the global South, the majority of the people. And even when it became clear that this ongoing conflict was having a detrimental impact on the vast majority of the world, the US and European powers persist. They have placed their interests above the interests of collective humanity. So the only response that we have is a more effective opposition. In the US, when the US decided that they were going to exclude the participation in the Summit of the Americas of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, we didn't moan. What we did, we engaged in counter-organizing. The Black Alliance for Peace, for example, we called on the nations of the Americas to boycott this gathering. We said that the U.S. had completely disqualified itself as a host for this meeting. That you can't pretend to be a partner and a hegemon. It is quite clear from U.S. policies in the region, from subversion to direct intervention, that U.S. had no intention in being a partner. It was committed to its hegemonic position in this region. So we have to respond by developing a more effective opposition. We say that we have to shift our attention to imperialism. We have to encourage our friends and partners in various countries, including the UK, to be more intentional, more effective in developing this popular opposition. We have to put onto the table some very difficult questions. For example, what we saw generated with the support around Ukraine is a sort of a cross-class white supremacist movement, something that I refer to as the White Lives Matter More movement. So this issue of white solidarity, European solidarity that people like Zelensky refers to, Europe, Europeanness, the West, they have to be challenged. If we don't challenge them effectively, we're never going to be able to undermine the credibility of formations like NATO. We're never going to be able to move the people and move policies away from popular support for militarism and war. We're never going to be able to undermine the ability of the US and Western Europe to continue to be a threat to collective humanity. So my friends, as I join you in these series of conversations, my position is going to be relatively sort of a broken record. We have the analysis. I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of these brilliant folks. And so we have the analysis. We've got to figure out how to be more effective in ensuring that our analysis is translated to the ground, how we can more effectively support the development of more effective anti-war, anti-imperialist movements, because that's the only and most effective weapon that we have for us. All of these international command structures by the U.S., this role that Britain plays as a lapdog to the U.S., the only way we're going to reverse this is through popular organization. So that's my message, my friends. I'm going to, like the rest of you, continue to listen and take notes so that we can sharpen our analysis and sharpen our ability to explain this. But in the end, this information has to be transferred to the ground. We have to build more effective base building grassroots organizations to engage these folks, because they are committed to power and they're committed to do whatever they need to do to maintain their power. And the only response we have is more effective oppositional people power. So thank you again for allowing me to be part of this. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversations.
Thank you so much, Ajamu, and thanks very much for very clearly spelling out what our tasks are and what we need to be focusing on in terms of building an effective international movement against this new Cold War, which is getting hotter by the day. And I think the analysis that the United States is going more and more into the military terrain is very serious and threatens not just the people of China, people of Russia, and any other country the United States and its allies target, but actually all of humanity, because we are talking about conflicts with nuclear armed states. So I think that call to action is very, very important. And we have our responsibilities in the belly of the beast in a country which is playing the belligerent role. And, despite the fact that we've got 24/7 propaganda trying to suggest that it's actually China or Russia that's playing the belligerent role, we have to hold our own governments to account in the United States and Britain. So look forward to further discussions about that and discussions about how we can increase the movement for peace in the global north, which is our responsibility. Really delighted to now introduce Nora Garcia, who today is speaking as a part of the Madrid Anti-NATO Peace Summit, which is being organised against the NATO Summit, which is happening at the end of June, which I think is quite a good moment to introduce Nora, because after what Gemma just said about the need to build an effective movement against what the United States and its allies are doing, what absolute perfect time to hand it over to Nora. Over to you, Nora.
Thank you very much to No Cold War Britain for the invitation, but above all for organizing such an important event, as you were saying, Fiona, at the doorstep of the NATO Summit in Madrid. This space is important because we must be prepared for the agenda that will be adopted at this summit. This terrible dream of a global NATO reinforced, which is not only a European issue, since it counts with global allies like Morocco, Colombia, Australia, or Japan. NATO has built an international network of arms agreements, military bases, operations, training with armies of many countries, intelligence, espionage, and interference in countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and which is now moving towards a greater confrontation with China, and even has planned to militarize space. The limit of war won't be the planet anymore, but the galaxy. Please read its nuts. In these 4 months of war in Ukraine, the international landscape has changed a lot and has made it difficult to unite a mass movement for peace and against NATO that mobilizes massively to answer NATO's empty discourse of democracy, peace, security, and defense of our values. There is a great debate in the battle of ideas and in the memory, in the history, but also a great challenge to mobilize and articulate concrete proposals to these discourses that divide us and further intensify this international crisis in which we live. And the fact is that this next NATO country summit is marked by the war in Ukraine and everything that underlies the agenda of this global NATO that is driven by the interest of the USA. In these 4 months, we are seeing things that a year ago we wouldn't have believed could happen. How the German government has taken a historic turn at the end of February by committing to invest more than 150,000 million euros in military spending. We see Finland and Sweden joining NATO without a referendum or even a minimum of democratic mechanisms. Biden makes very dangerous statements about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, drawing a dangerous parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan. He pretends for us to forget that Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China and that China's internal problems should be solved in China. Sanctions on Russia triggers inflation, further increase of global food insecurity, energy poverty. Moreover, the framework of discussion has become polarized in these blocks, and this blocks a serious analysis of a truly dangerous world situation. All this should be a wake-up call for those of us who fight for peace, as Ajamu was saying, because peace cannot be just an idea, must be a political practice, a common strategy that involves the trade unions, the feminist movement, the ecologist movement, anti-racist movement, etc., in a broader alliance for another world order that fills peace with meaning, with social justice, and that articulates international relations in democracy, mutual support, and the sovereignty of the peoples. We see how these last few months have made it clear that the framework of the United Nations have been emptied and that it is necessary to return to the founding elements of the United Nations Charter and return to build effective commitments to disarmament, dialogue, and respect among each other. We cannot assume that the international community is NATO, because that would make invisible the map we saw in April when the UN suspended Russia's membership of the Human Rights Council, with 93 countries voting in favor, but 24 against and 58 abstentions. The world is diverse and people must be able to decide their own path. We cannot address the war in Ukraine without seeing that it is essential to articulate ourselves against the Cold War against China in the face of a risk, moreover, of a future hot war. We must understand that if peace was really wanted, the war in Ukraine wouldn't have started. If peace were really wanted, the war in Ukraine we have already ended. A ceasefire and a return to negotiations between Ukraine and Russia is urgent, but so it is stopping this process that is once again dividing the world into two blocks. Peace will not be achieved in a divided world, but neither by following the wishes of the USA with its dream of becoming the only power. And that leads us to disaster because they don't assume the current reality of a multipolar world with multiple poles and diverse national and regional projects and alliances. A lasting peace is achieved in a world in dialogue that moves forward by tackling people's real problems, such as poverty, hunger, the climate crisis, and access to healthcare. To those who call us peace activists naive, we must say that following the wishes of the USA is delirious. As an example, we have the European Union acting against the interests of its own people, renouncing to have its own project, following the orders of the USA. A European Union that speaks of Europe as if Russia isn't also Europe, and that therefore we are interconnected whether we like it or not. Moreover, high representatives of the European Union sending us the message that each one of us is also at war. Why are they using war rhetoric, making us individually responsible and encouraging us to promote boycotts? When Josep Borrell said to us, turn down your home heating, turn off the gas, everyone needs to make an individual effort to cut their gas consumption, is because they want us on board. They want us to wage war from our homes, promoting hatred against the Russian population who also lives with us, while we will be freezing next winter because we can't pay the bill. All wars end with dialogue and negotiations. Let's start now. Let's stop the disaster. Many articles have been written. Many analyses have been made. Not all of us think the same, but it is time to get people out to the streets. It is time to shake up minds, to send an alternative message to this nonsense that normalizes war, death, racism, hatred, and poverty, that makes invisible the other wars that also causes death and destruction, that reinforces colonial mentality and divides us as peoples. We need a new compass, and it's time to work. I want these minutes to reflect on how to really work together, because there is no other way. Struggle is the only way, and we do not fight alone, we fight with others. Let us tackle the fundamental work that has been postponed, that has been attempted but frustrated at some point. In the face of this irresponsibility of NATO governments, we must put common sense, the people's lives, and the planet first. In recent months, as I said at the beginning, events have made it harder to articulate this massive movement for peace and against NATO. And that is why it is essential to mobilize for the summit that will take place in Madrid. We need dialogue to address the mechanisms that promote war and the reasons behind the war. A dialogue with people to collectively understand that peace is not only a priority for the peace movement, but for everyone. That is why we call you to the Peace Summit, No to NATO, next week in Madrid, next weekend. Next Friday and Saturday, we will be having panels, debates, workshops, and on Sunday morning, we will march in the streets of Madrid for peace against NATO and against wars. I hope we can sit down to think about objectives, but also about campaigns, about concrete things to organize ourselves, about tools to talk to our neighbors, to act in our unions, in our movements. And for those of you that are coming to Madrid, we have a workshop on international perspective and strategies for peace next Saturday at 4 p.m. to debate this further. It is the moment to organize ourselves in this common struggle, because struggle is the only way. So see you in Madrid.
Thank you so much, Nora. And I hope a few people are going to come to Madrid after hearing you speak. Hi, everyone. Good evening. And hi, wherever you are. I'm Suzie Gilbert with No Cold War Britain, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, as well as Code Pink in the US. It's great to see everyone's comments in the chat. Please keep chatting away. And we're next going to go to Vijay Prashad. Many of you know him. He's written many, many books, including a new one that's coming out anytime now with Chomsky, which is called The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of US Power. Vijay is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and he's currently on a bus somewhere, I believe, in Mexico. So in order to be safe, he pre-recorded his video. So we're going to show that to you now. Thank you.
Greetings from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We have been hard at work trying our best to understand this very upsetting global situation. 3 billion people struggle with hunger, and yet $40 trillion sits in illicit tax havens. 22 of the world's richest men have more money than all the women in Africa, which means 22 men have more money than 325 million women in Africa. Such an abomination, such cruelty. Our work at Tricontinental is rooted in these dilemmas of humanity. We wish there were more attention paid to these dilemmas, our social wealth turned over to address them rather than to the fantasy of global hegemony and warfare. This talk I'm giving you today at the No Cold War platform is called Brexit? Really? But by the end of it, you'll see why I've called it that. Before I get into the talk, I want to tell you about a series of articles that were jointly produced by Morning Star, Tricontinental, Globetrotter, and the Peace and Justice Project. These articles were written by Manolo de los Santos, Prashant Radhakrishnan, Kate Hudson, Marco Fernandez, Nora Garcia, Nontobek Ohlela, Claudia Webb, Jeremy Corbyn, Roger Mackenzie, and I. They will be put together in a booklet in English, Portuguese, Spanish, and published in a few weeks. Please look out for them. These articles combined make a powerful argument on behalf of a world that is not dominated either by one country or by two blocs. We want to live in a global democracy, not in a world of domination and of walls. I'm speaking to you from Mexico, where President Andrés Manuel López Obrador declined to participate in US President Joe Biden's Summit of the Americas. Why did AMLO, that's what the Mexican president is known as, his initials, why did AMLO make this decision? Because the United States hosted a summit of the hemisphere while excluding Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Bolivia and Honduras joined Mexico in boycotting Biden's summit. They are in favor of a genuine regionalism, one that is anchored in the process called CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. This is a regionalism that seeks to better the people of the hemisphere and not to allow one or two countries to dominate the entire region. The Americas is where the United States imposed the Monroe Doctrine 100 years ago next year. This Monroe Doctrine gave the United States the authority, or rather it was authority that the United States gave to itself to dominate the entire hemisphere. Biden's summit was a fiasco. That's as it would be, given that the mood across the world is no longer in favor of US hegemony. This mood I'm talking about is not only against US hegemony in places you'd expect, such as in China and in Cuba, but also in places such as Australia, India, and Japan, three countries that make up the Quad, the US project to encircle China. These countries, Australia, India, Japan, don't want anything to do fully with this imposition of US hegemony. Now, no longer just the Monroe Doctrine for the Americas, but a global Monroe Doctrine with talk of global NATO, or in their case, Asian NATO, and other such hallucinations. Australia's people recently rejected the right-wing government and brought back the Labour Party. It's not perfect, of course, but still rational about the fact that Australia's principal trade partner is China, and that any anti-China moves will demolish Australia in the same way as Europe is struggling with the war in Ukraine, struggling economically in terms of inflation and so on. India and Japan continue to trade with Russia, increasing investments in Russia's oil and natural gas projects. They have openly said that they're unwilling to toe the line put forward by the United States. The global Monroe Doctrine is not for them, nor is an Asian NATO, the other name for the Quad. They'll remain members of the Quad, yes, but they will not be reckless in accelerating dangerous warfare. That's the mood I was talking about. You can read more about it in the third briefing from No Cold War, which will be out in the Tricontinental newsletter on Thursday, the 16th of June. The United Kingdom, by the way, shifting to the UK, the United Kingdom is on its own planet. We heard a lot about Brexit. The enemy was Brussels. Turns out that the Leave camp in the United Kingdom was only against one address in Brussels, that of the European Union. The UK wanted to be free of the regulatory framework of the European Union. But the United Kingdom is not only happy with the other address in Brussels, but it's one of its keenest advocates, and that's the address of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And those of you who don't know, it's headquartered in Brussels, in Belgium. NATO, as we know, is not really a European platform. It's a Trojan horse of US power. And the UK is the poodle of US ambitions. So the Leave campaign's Brexit was half-baked. Leave the European Union trade framework, but be sucked further into NATO belligerence. The UK claimed that Brexit was about the exercise of its sovereignty. But we can see that the UK continues to have its military sovereignty exercised from Washington, DC. You want a real Brexit? Then leave your poodle-like subordination to the United States. Nobody wants to imagine the full implications of the encirclement of Russia and China by the United States and its allies, including the United Kingdom. Even countries that are closely allied with the United States, such as Germany and Japan, recognize that if a new Iron Curtain descends around China and Russia, it would be fatal for their own countries. Already the war and sanctions have created political crises in Honduras, Pakistan, Peru, and Sri Lanka, with others to follow as food and fuel prices rise astronomically. War is too expensive for the poorer nations. Spending for war is eating into the human spirit, and warfare itself increases people's general sense of despair. The war makers are the idealists. Their wars do not settle the major dilemmas of humanity. The ideas of non-alignment and peace, on the other hand, are realistic. Their framework, the framework of non-alignment and peace, this framework has answers to the children who want to eat and to learn and to play and to dream. We are the real realists. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. Glad we didn't catch him on the bus in Mexico. We are now going to go to Ben Chacko, who some of you will know is the editor of the Morning Star. Let's see if we have Ben. Yep.
Hi, thanks very much, Suzie. And thanks for inviting me to speak at this really important meeting this evening. It's very obvious that Britain is a junior partner to the United States, as Vijay has just said, but it doesn't mean that Britain is irrelevant or lacks influence. Britain's role has been key in a number of US wars, not so much because of its military contribution, as for the diplomatic cover provided for US aggression. Over Iraq, for instance, allowing the United States to claim it was acting for a coalition of the willing, rather than simply launching an illegal war on its own. And Britain can even, despite its junior status, act as an outrider for the most aggressive sections of the US ruling class and influence US actions. Tony Blair was more gung-ho than Bill Clinton on launching the war against Yugoslavia in 1999. And to an even greater extent, Tony Blair, British and French aggression played a role in convincing an initially skeptical Barack Obama to destroy Libya in 2010-11. Conversely, David Cameron's defeat by Ed Miliband in a parliamentary vote on war on Syria in 2013 held back the US from a full invasion of that country. So what we do in Britain and the strength of the peace movement in Britain really does matter. It appears at the moment that Britain is playing a sort of incitement to violence role as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. Britain has been a subservient partner so far in the new Cold War on China, following the US lead when it comes to decoupling trade, inflicting fairly serious damage to our own infrastructure and development by cancelling part-completed projects like the 5G upgrade because of US instructions not to work with Chinese companies. With the EU and Canada, it has parroted Washington's allegations about Chinese policies in Xinjiang and coordinated sanctions on China. This hampers cooperation on global problems like climate change, especially since China is the world leader in green technology and renewable energy. And it took the early form of restrictions on Chinese exports of solar panels and wind turbines. We're seeing artificial panic being whipped up by reactionary Tories like Ian Duncan Smith and right-wing papers like the Daily Telegraph about Chinese influence in British institutions, which have the practical effect of disrupting joint scientific research and encouraging the racist persecution of Chinese people working over here. This is obviously negative and has echoes of anti-Chinese witch hunts in the United States, particularly under Donald Trump, and in Australia. But it's very much the dog wagging the tail, if you like. The United States sets the line and Britain follows. Unfortunately, Britain's attitude since the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been, if anything, more reckless than that of Washington itself. Britain has dismissed and attacked half-hearted efforts by NATO members such as France to seek a ceasefire and negotiated solution, with Liz Truss insisting that nothing short of Russian defeat will do. The Stop the War coalition has been right to characterize that stance as being willing to fight Russia to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. The war in Ukraine is costing thousands of lives. Given Russia's far larger size and military, Russian defeat is only conceivable as a result of one of two scenarios. The result of a full-on clash between Russia and NATO, which would likely go nuclear and could wipe out much of the human race and leave Europe an uninhabitable wasteland, or by the gradual sapping of Russian morale through inflicting heavy losses in a long war. The latter is evidently current US policy, but it rests in being willing for Ukrainians and Russians to keep dying in this conflict for years to come. It should be utterly unacceptable to everyone on the left, whatever their view of the Russian state. While the US appears committed to this policy, summoning arms firms to the Pentagon to spur them on to developing new technologies for its long proxy war with Russia, Biden has shown some awareness that escalating the conflict has risks. The US ruled out a no-fly zone that would have involved shooting down Russian aircraft when British politicians were flirting with one. In supplying medium-range missiles to Ukraine, Joe Biden did ask for guarantees, probably not worth very much, that they would not be used to attack targets in Russia, while Britain's defense secretary stated explicitly that Ukraine would be entitled to use our weaponry to attack Russia. Here we see a really dangerous role being played by Britain, because the acts of politicians don't all take place according to some master plan, but they are influenced by each other. Just as Germany has been pressed to send more armaments to Ukraine for fear of looking like it's doing less than other NATO states, British belligerence eggs the US on and influences Biden because he fears being outflanked domestically by hawkish Republican politicians. Each such escalation undermines the chances of a negotiated peace and raises the risk of a direct clash between Russia and NATO. That places huge responsibility on us in the British peace movement to build opposition to this proxy war, to oppose attempts to paint supporters of peace as traitors whose views are apparently now unacceptable in the party of organised labour. We have to build organisations like No Cold War, like Stop the War and CND, and build a mass movement for peace which is stronger even than that which marched against Iraq. War between NATO and Russia would be horrific, and Britain's position on all of this really does matter. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. And now I'm excited to welcome our next speaker, who is Radhika Desai, who is a professor at the University of Manitoba and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Suzie. I guess I've decided to focus more on the incoherence of NATO and the dangers that are located in it. So I've titled my remarks, "A Spectre is Haunting NATO, the Spectre of China." NATO's Madrid summit can only be a disaster in motion. It has been billed as the organization's most consequential and transformative gathering of the post-Cold War era. And with its proxy war over Ukraine still grinding on, NATO has enjoyed enhanced prominence and has a crammed agenda at Madrid. It is to demonstrate its much wanted unity, admit Sweden and Finland, supply more heavy weapons to Ukraine, adopt a new strategic concept, to name only the more pressing agenda items. The Madrid summit will also be the first time that it will focus on creating a Pacific presence. To that end, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand have been invited to attend. And the strategic concept is expected to focus inter alia on the re-emergence of great power competition and include the consideration of the question of how much emphasis should NATO put on Russia's immediate threat to Europe, as opposed to the more systemic challenge represented by China's strategic rise. I'm quoting one of the articles in the NATO review. If we can agree that by expanding NATO by expanding as it has over the post-Cold War period, without any critically important enemy, NATO had already become dangerously incoherent, without any real military purpose other than to sell more US arms to newer members, or any clarity about whether its increasingly diverse and often conflicting members would actually respond as Article 5 requires in the case of an attack on any one of its members. So this was already a problem. Now this problem is about to get a lot worse. There is one foreign policy principle that has, over the past decade and a bit more, commanded acceptance across the American foreign policy spectrum, from the liberal internationalists who have been in power more or less continuously in the post-Cold War period, with the possible exception of the Trump interregnum, to the realists who had their heyday back in the 1970s when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. That principle is that China represents the greatest threat to the United States. It is not without significance that the most important foreign policy statement in the run-up to the NATO summit has not been about Russia. It hasn't even been about Europe. It has been about China. China is, in the words of the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, which I think Panghua already quoted, is the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, because according to him, it has both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. The Atlantic Council's foreign policy recommendations, styled after George Kennan's long telegram in a document called the Longer Telegram, was also all about China. It is, to quote the document, the US's single most important challenge, thanks to the scale of its economy and its military, the speed of its technological advancement, and its radically different worldview. Where they differ is on Russia, whereas for liberal internationalist Antony Blinken, Russian President Vladimir Putin poses a clear and present threat. For the realist Atlantic Council, the United States must rebalance its relationship with Russia and divide the two giant countries, allowing Russia to drift fully into China's strategic embrace over the last decade. The Atlantic Council document was published in early 2021, allowing Russia to drift fully into China's strategic embrace over the last decade will go down as the single greatest geostrategic error of successive US administrations. This has also, of course, been the position of prominent realists today, such as Henry Kissinger or John Mearsheimer, who have advocated greater restraint on the part of the West vis-a-vis Russia, but they all agree about China. So at the Madrid summit, expect at least three major sources of tension and incoherence. First, the Biden administration, as the Biden administration engages in its deliberate yet impulsive, as the Washington Post described it, proxy war on Russia in a limited and calculated fashion. The United States' venomous rhetoric about Russia and Putin have an inverse relationship to the United States' actual contribution and sacrifice, which keeps well short of military engagement, supplies arms manufacturers for profit to Ukraine, who has been indebting very seriously. The sharp contrast this forms with the near economic suicide that it expects from European countries has naturally bred suspicion and resentment. The United States' focus is clearly on China. Secondly, underneath the unity of NATO, underneath the unity that NATO has allegedly found over its proxy war on Russia, divisions are festering. The new arms expenditures undertaken by Germany, for instance, are capable of being used both within the NATO context or independently of it. East European members have different historically and strategically grounded attitudes about the war. Traditionally Russophobic Eastern European and Baltic countries call out the French and the Germans for continuing their discussions with Russia. Turkey objects to Finnish and Swedish membership. France is even witnessing the electoral surge of forces clearly opposed to NATO. If on top of all this, NATO members are asked to aid the US in an even more dangerous and losing war with China, it can only stretch NATO to breaking point. The European countries, already exhausted by the price they have had to pay for the war over Russia, are unlikely to agree to what will be required in a similar scenario against China. Too many of them have been rightly and beneficially deepening their economic ties with China. NATO has never been about security, I think somebody has already alluded to, but let me remind everybody of Lord Ismay's point about what NATO is about. It was about keeping the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. It was always about giving the United States a presence in Europe that has not increased European security or stability. It has always detracted from it. So the United States, so NATO has been the US's cat's paw in Europe. It's funny because I use this term here in my text and somebody else used it as well. Anyway, it supports not international law and peace, but what the United States calls the rules-based international order, which is simply US speak for essentially exercising its domination, which always entails conflict. It can continue existing only as a dangerous, disarticulated incoherence that is armed to the teeth and is incoherent in its actions. It can only pose a danger to the world as an extremely powerful machine that has gone out of control. It must be abolished now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. We are next joined by John Ross, who many of you know is a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at the Renmin University of China. He's also a member in a personal capacity of the International No Cold War Collective. Hi, John.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Listen, for all the great speakers, and thanks very much for the event. Okay, I want to, many speakers have referred to the question of the aggression which is undertaken by the United States. So I want to concentrate more specifically on the question of the war in Ukraine, because I think this is a qualitative step for the United States and opens up a very serious and dangerous period for humanity. So I want to try to explain why. Up until now, the United States has attacked developing countries, Serbia, Iraq, invaded Afghanistan, bombed Libya, etc. There are others as well. This was totally unjust, but the United States knew, one, it had overwhelming military superiority, and secondly, there was no threat of a nuclear conflict coming out of it. But in the case of Ukraine, the United States was prepared quite consciously to cross the red lines of a nuclear armed major state, Russia. It knew that these were the red lines. Why? Firstly, because Russia said it. Secondly, because it can work it out very simply. There's a very clear comparison, which is to Cuba in 1962. When there were missiles in Cuba in 1962, the United States made quite clear that it was prepared to have, if necessary, world nuclear war in order to remove them. It was totally unacceptable. Why? Because missiles in Cuba were 800 kilometers from Washington, and it would make military defense of the United States against surprise attack impossible. Well, actually, the distance from Kiev to Moscow is half the distance from Havana to Moscow. So you don't have to be a brilliant military strategist to work out that if the defense of the United States from a missile attack from Cuba is impossible, the attack on Russia from missiles and NATO inside Ukraine is even more impossible. So the United States knew, both from what Russia had said and from its own experience, what the stakes were. Yet it was perfectly prepared to go ahead. Now, it was careful on one thing. It didn't know what the response would be. That is why Biden made clear that the United States would not commit military force. So direct military force, it would supply weapons, etc. There's a very good Chinese phrase which says, crossing the river while feeling the stones beneath your feet. It's normally used about Chinese economic policy, but it's very good in this case, it explains it. The US knew it could attack developing countries and did so. It didn't know what would be exactly the response when it crossed Russia's red lines, but it was prepared to do so. And this is a qualitative escalation. Also, the United States at the present time very actively attempting to develop a first strike nuclear capacity against Russia and China. This is not secret. This is quite openly stated by the theorists of US foreign policy. And it's shown in the US withdrawal from a whole series of arms limitation and arms control treaties, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, etc. Now, therefore, this is the United States finding out what escalation it can do. Why did it attack Russia? And because this is what it is. It knew that when it went into the Ukraine, it hoped, of course, Russia would just not respond. Then that would be a big victory for the United States. But it knew there was certainly a risk that if it moved Ukraine into NATO, there would be a conflict, which of course there has been. In 1962, the Soviet leadership had the good sense to take the missiles out of Cuba. In the case of the United States, it refused to take off the table Ukraine joining NATO. If it had done so, there would have been no war. Okay. There is a booklet, incidentally, coming out on this, published by No Cold War, Monthly Review, and Tricontinental, which has got articles by John Bellamy Foster, who's the editor of Monthly Review, Debbie Venizali, an introduction by Vijay, and an article by myself. I hope people will read it incidentally when it comes out, because it looks at these things in more detail. Why did it attack Russia? It was part of its policy against China. The United States is losing in peaceful economic competition with China. This has led some on the left, in my opinion, to a false view that somehow the defeat of the United States is inevitable or determined by economic forces. And I have to say, I don't agree with it. The United States still maintains one area in which it's absolutely dominant, which is military. And therefore, the temptation for the United States is to attempt to use its military power in order to compensate for its economic defeat. And this is the great danger which confronts the world. If we look at it from that point of view, what is the significance of the good relations between China and Russia? It's not that China is going to attack the United States. It doesn't have 800 military bases around the world like the United States. Russia doesn't have 800 military bases around the world like the United States. It's the following. Russia is the only power which has nuclear parity with the United States. Eventually, China will have nuclear parity with the United States, but that will take quite some time. Russia has it now. Therefore, the good relations which exist between Russia and China are a big obstacle for the United States. And what the United States wanted to do was to knock Russia out of its good relations with China. either by making concessions to Russia, that was the old policy of Kissinger, or by force. And that's why it's attacked. It was prepared to have this confrontation with Russia. It is immediately having a confrontation with Russia, but its strategic goal is to isolate and attack China. And we should have no illusions. The United States has shown no inclination to be inhibited by anything. I am perfectly believe, without second hesitation, anybody else should do, if the United States could gain a first strike nuclear capacity against Russia or China, or Russia and China, it would use it. There is no degree of ruthlessness to which the United States has shown it won't go. It completely destroyed North Korea. It attempted to completely destroy the north of Vietnam, and it would do things in that way. Therefore, we have to understand that we are at a very crucial point of escalation. And therefore, the outcome of the war in Ukraine is very important. If the United States, it's testing, it knows it can attack developing countries. Now it's seen if it can, in fact, provoke a war with Russia. And if it can do that, it will go further against the question of China, and it will go further against the question of the use of nuclear weapons. What is crucial in that situation is that all progressive forces in the world unite. And by all, I mean not merely the ones that we know in Britain. I'm absolutely in favor of Stop the War, CND, Britain, No Cold War Britain, organising together, but I'm in favour of people who are not really part of the left at all also becoming involved in this. There are people in the United States who are supporters of the United States who think it's crazy to play around with such wars. I'm all in favour of supporting them. There are some people who I have total disagreement with, Vince Cable, for example, who want a rational policy to China. So confronted with this real danger to humanity, this qualitative escalation, first we have to make sure that the United States is defeated in this attempt to escalate war. And secondly, we have to understand that it will continue, and this is a new point in escalation. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll all support No Cold War Britain, of course.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to our terrific speakers and the amazing audience, and for all your comments and contributions in the chat. Please keep them coming. We'd love you to all get involved. Please, if you haven't already signed the No Cold War International Statement at nocoldwar.org, please do so. And obviously, please follow No Cold War and No Cold War Britain on social media. And we've had so many great contributions, and I think we can be inspired by some of the leaders of the global south. We've heard about AMLO standing up to Biden around the summit of the Americas. Some of you will remember Lula, possibly the next president of Brazil, you know, fifth largest country in the world, being very critical of US militarism in Ukraine. And many of us were actually together last year at Glasgow discussing the militarism and the climate movement. And just as a reminder that the US military is the single largest industrial polluter on the planet. So, you know, there is opportunity to get together with the climate movement on this as well. Anyway, thank you so much for everyone being here. We're now going to ask you to, we'll welcome back Callum Baird, who's going to do a bit of a musical ending. And we really would encourage you to chat and share more in the Zoom chat, and let us know where you're from or any organizations you're involved with. And a big thank you to all our terrific speakers.
Hello again, everybody. Thanks very much to No Cold War Britain again for having me here. It's been a pleasure to be part of this panel and to listen to the excellent contributions from international speakers. It's great to see a vibrant and organised international peace movement. We're going to need it, clearly, and it's a pleasure to be part of it and to be singing for you. I'm going to do you a song by the American folk singer and musician Phil Oakes, who's a great hero of mine, if you like. And this song's called When I'm Gone, and I suppose it echoes a lot of the contributions about getting involved and how you can get involved, and the opportunities for struggle and organising. So thank you very much. My name's Callum Baird, and I'll see you around. There's no place in this world where I'll belong when I'm gone, and I won't know the right from the wrong when I'm gone. And you won't find me singing on this song when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. And I won't feel the flowing of the time when I'm gone. All the pleasures of love will not be mine when I'm gone. My pen won't pour a lyric line when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. And I won't breathe the bracing air when I'm gone, and I can't even worry about my cares when I'm gone. Won't be asked to do my share when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. And I won't be running from the rain when I'm gone, and I can't even suffer from the pain when I'm gone. Can't say who's to praise and who's to blame when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. Won't see the golden of the sun when I'm gone, and the evenings and the mornings will be one when I'm gone. Can't be singing louder than the guns when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. All my days won't be dances of delight when I'm gone, and the sands will be shifting from my side when I'm gone. Can add my name into the fight when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. And I won't be laughing at the lies when I'm gone, and I can't question how or when or why when I'm gone. Can't live proud enough to die when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. There's no place in this world where I'll belong when I'm gone, and I won't know the right from the wrong when I'm gone. And you won't find me singing on this song when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it. I guess I'll have to do it. Guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Callum. Thank you to all our fantastic speakers and the really, really engaged, awesome audience. Thank you for what you will do. Good night, or wherever you are. Good afternoon. Thank you. Bye.